I today we're in Boston, and this is an attempt in a long series that we meant to do for a long time, to do talks with architects that have a sense of social responsibility. And in that sense, we're currently in a time where everyone hears the word war, so they want to think about shelter, but we also have to think about how to continue a healthy state of society. And so we might as well get into a dialogue about appropriate architecture. And today we're visiting Paul Laffoley, who got injured down in that area, but not during that time. But his records in his injury are, as far as I remember, also affected by everything being closed down there. And during his time when he worked as an architect on the World Trade Center, he already had a chance to make some input about how the design should be, and he had a very hard time then, which was a long time ago. So today we're visiting with him, and he has a chance to give us some of his current opinions about the design of a tall building in a place like New York, the center of such an intense activity. And interesting to hear what he has to say today in 2001 after this disaster, and with some comments about how we might prevent things turning into a war. And we feel that maybe with this kind of dialogue we let people know how we can contribute with appropriate technology, appropriate architecture to peacekeeping. Here's Paul Laffoley.
Hello. Okay. What Werner was referring to is the fact in 1962, right after I left high school, I wanted to find out if I'd like to be in architecture. And so I simply went to New York and went around to different architectural firms. And they'd ask me questions like, can you do working drawings? I said, no. Can you do renderings? No. Can you do this, that, and the next thing? And then I'd be refused. Finally, I came to this place on 50th Street on 2nd Avenue called Emery Roth and Sons. And I went through the same ritual. And after a while, the guy says, okay, put him in the design group. I said, wow. This is incredible, because usually, that's not going to happen. Somebody would be in a firm a long time before they would be in the design group or would come in from the outside. And it turned out that Emery Roth and Sons was simply what is called in the architectural game as a pencil, meaning that they were the liaison and an office that was used by people who would be considered very prominent designers that would come into New York and use their office. So the preferred areas in the office where it was actually the production crew. So the design part was simply kind of a superfluous and like part of it. Just it had to be there. So we're sitting there. And then the bell rings, and they said, "Well, what do you mean?" Well, okay, we're all going to go into the boardroom because Minoru Yamasaki had showed up. That was their next building. So he brings in this model, of the two twin towers, and people started asking, "What's inside it?" I said, "Wow, this I have," and he had a big pile of papers. And he said, this is what's supposed to be inside of it, the program. And so then the shock started to hit that there was no plans for this building that showed the interior situation. He started making statements like, I think you guys need to design about 18 elevator banks, to meet the code and this kind of stuff. All he brought was an exterior model, nothing else. And and we started instantly. We became the big part of the situation because the other people that were hired knew nothing about it. I started to. I'm a pretty good designer, so I immediately saw the situation. And as a matter of fact, some background said, when he was referring to the piles of paper, for the program, they said, and he says, "Well, boys, fill her up." And he said, what do you want, high test or regular? At that time, gasoline was designated that way. He turned livid. He just went completely purple, turned around, and walked out. Was never seen again. What happened after that is everybody thought that we lost the commission. It was going to be a joint venture. But 2 weeks later, the liaison officer, called up and said, "How's it going?" And then the guy on the other end, one of the partners, said, "How's what's going?" So I'm the liaison officer from the Yamasaki office in Chicago, and then he said, "Well, wait, we thought that you had denied us the joint venture." No, the guy was on the phone, went ballistic. He ran out. "We got the job. We got it. So let's get going." So we started to figure out, read the program, and started to figure out things like that to fulfill the program, you could have left the last 15 floors near the top vacant. It just would be completely empty space. And
but they just wanted 100 floors anyway.
Yeah, so they just added the floors. And then it turned out that in terms of the plan, say if this was a plan of it, that you would have about this much space occupied with all these elevator banks, and all the pipe. Actually the pipes are in a different place, but there was a whole lot of service things. And then the next question was, how are we going to structure this? And then that was asked to the liaison officer, and then it goes back and mumble, and then Yamasaki said, only X bracing on the interior surfaces of where the elevator banks are. Jaws dropped, bounced on the floor. I said, what? That means the engineering footprint of it that holds the building up is now smaller than the architectural footprint. And so you have something that's now the same width at the top as it is at the bottom, which is the stupidest way that you can possibly design a building. But he had two of them. Okay, so and then he claimed that the exterior thing, those little thin tendrils, was supposed to be structural. They don't. Those were almost like gutters, and things where you'd have electrical systems that went into it. As I was designing along, I actually designed floors 15 to 45 in Tower 2, the North Tower, the one that got hit first, and it actually hit right on the floors that I designed. So I feel a very personal relationship with this.
Good.
And that the external structure really played very, very little part in holding the building up. And so as I was designing along here, it became obvious that the amount of space that you could rent on the flat was a kind of very thick corridor that went around it. Of course, you had the elevator banks, then you have an access corridor. So what ended up is you had these little boxes all around, and then since you had two of these towers, so here's a couple of them like this, and they were oriented like this. I said, what about every fourth level that you have a bridge connecting them? So as the towers went up, you'd see like what would look like a ladder, and what it would do is that it would structure. It would be a very strong bridge that would structure into where where this thing was in the middle. So the strongest part of the building was here, and so this would go through the floor, go through the next one, and connect that way. And what that would do is it would help hold the things up, and also give a company a chance to have more flat space, to rent, where they could do office landscaping. Everybody in the office thought, "Wow, hey, that's a really great idea." So we'll go and call up the the liaison officer. That guy thought it was great. So he said, I'm going to talk to the old man. Next day, he comes back with an announcement. Whoever the guy was who made that suggestion, fire him right now, which was me. So I get fired the next day because Yamasaki wanted this prism pure thing of only these two towers with no connections at all. So I said to myself at that time, because the lower part, there was a square box with these things sticking up, and there was a lot of functions that were down there, which were never done. And for people who've walked through it, it's like an empty space. It's horrible. And that it also was gewgawed all. In other words, it had to be reshaped to fit the subway. It just simply was a model that they were going to shove onto the top of Manhattan down in that space, and then let whatever was necessary to work there, because that thing went through it like it was going through butter. When the Empire State Building was hit, which has a triangular shape like that. In other words, it was a smaller plane, but it went through the building. It didn't make the building go like that, But this one, because the architectural footprint and all those spaces were so lightly designed. You see, in other words, they had to be lightly designed, or else those things would never have stood up at all. So it was as if you had this thing in the middle, and then all the floors were cantilevered, and then you had a light surface where you had the glass. So you basically had curtain walls, and you had all these stripes that were bringing down mechanical systems and electrical systems, because they discovered that they ended up having more phone systems than in the city of Detroit within those two buildings, so that somebody who was in there could sit in a little cubby hole, and then talk to other people in the building, because otherwise you'd have to go out, get in an elevator, go up and down, up and down, up and down all day long to get any work done.
The question came up, why was the building chosen in the way it was? Well, in those days I was a structural engineer, and I worked with the engineers. From the 60s on, what happened is that we had what was called cyber technology. That was before we had personal computers and all of this. So in other words, we all of a sudden had the computer world coming into engineering, and the engineers were all of a sudden forced to find less material to achieve a certain thing. So the engineer all of a sudden could calculate what kind of a structure would keep it up. They had to make decisions what would happen if an airplane knocks it. So in other words, you can design it for an impact force. No one in those days would think that a full airplane with all of this fuel would be melting the columns. They would have never, if anyone in the design team or the engineers would brought this up. I mean, when I was an engineer, I used to occasionally bring things up like that, and they look at me like, come on, So some of these things just didn't fit into the equation of making it a building that was a success from the financial level. All of the banks in those days that used to design their high-rise buildings in Boston, where I was working, State Street Bank, I used to sit in offices in meetings, in preliminary meetings, and banks insisted they had to have 3 more floors for prestige, to beat the other company whose buildings were 3 less. So the entire design attitude in those days was about getting more and getting more done, and the computers allowed people all of a sudden to design. It's very easy on a grid of X, Y, Z to plot in these points. It's a lot more complicated having to do a curved thing. So in other words, they designed what was easiest to calculate, and having all these floors on top of each other was from the calculating point easiest. It allowed also the consulting engineer to give the architect some, the go-ahead. Usually we had to come and calculate the weight in order to design the foundation. So they all had to work together, and they probably all worked against the clock. and there was no real thinking in those days.
They were designing file cabinets in
They were
space.
exactly, you know.
Right.
And then since the time when people started being critical of this stuff, like Paul left and other people, and I used to work with architects in New York, they would also leave, and they were looking for a new direction in architecture, except there was never a real voice. Some of the people that were utopian designers, Paolo Soleri, let's say, or Buckminster Fuller, they never really went anywhere. Fuller
And Frederick Kiesler.
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there was never a real dialogue, I think, about what really makes sense. I mean, Paul has been trying to have a dialogue about appropriate architecture and designing it. You know, Paul's approach usually to a building was, if it was a big building in a big city, it had to be also a spiritual center. And you know, the joke we used to hear about tall buildings was always the phallic symbol, you know, the rocket. I mean, every thinker would use to demonstrate of how our collective mind was going, pointing to the fact that, you know, we are really all very proud having these rockets going to the moon and having these twin towers go up. Like here we have these big penises, and I think we're now old enough to realize there's more to life than an erection or a rocket. And so I think the architecture dialogue has to somehow wake up, and we have to get out from being hypnotized by these magicians who get their stuff going, because ultimately the guys that get away with the stuff and the guys that drive in and destroy them, they're almost on the same equal wavelengths. They just have no regards for human life. They design buildings where they don't really care whether you get a headache and sick and the stress that you go through living and working in these buildings. I mean, no one has ever talked about it. And you know, I don't know what happened to the dialogue in Boston about architects for social responsibility. I think that dialogue probably
There isn't any.
It died, right?
I mean, well, they have Build Boston, where they try to do that every year, but it simply becomes a place where people who belong to the American Institute of Architects can go and get credits for courses, because they're making the requirements. I belong to both the Boston Society of Architects and the American Institute of Architects now, and they're going to up the ante with that. I mean, it's hard enough to get the license, but then they're going to start to make it eventually. So you'll have to be you have to constantly be re-educated to the latest stuff that they're coming up with, and that's going to be not with the spirit of doing it right, but simply with the letter, like somebody trying to pass a course.
Well, that's exactly what's happening. I mean, I watched one architect who was part of these.
Yeah.
He was a young architect.
Yeah.
He was part of these architects with social responsibility. He designed houses, solar houses, and green, and thinking ahead in a different way. And when he had to deal with redesign of an existing building, he ran into what is the worst currently is because of these terror attacks and fire. The law has come down, I think, on engineers and architects. So now if you're a designer, you only go if you can read all the codes, and you like a lawyer, you find your way through to get the thing done. A designer
you're on
right
the
now,
phone. You're not
designer
drawing.
doesn't design anymore.
You're not in front of a computer.
Right.
You're on the phone, juggling stuff like a lawyer.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, we hope that we can open up a dialogue somehow. We tried years ago once. We had a show on cable with Joe, who in the meantime died, and Paul and I, and we tried to do this Videosphere show, which was supposed to use television to let people around the world know how else we can build without having to go into war because we're building. So we hope that we can have a few more installation of these kind of discussions. And thanks, Paul, for surviving so far. We're all survivors. We didn't get hit yet. And I want to say what sort of went on through me in me when I saw these buildings get hit twice. When 30 years or so, when we went to the moon and we needed to have television to see that they're taking us to the moon and all this stuff, I felt instinctively to be saying, I think we're acting like kids who are grown up and we think we have it all together to go into outer space with technology. Before we do this, we should get it together here on the planet first. And for 30 years, I had a feeling that we never got that communicated, and I felt sad that having these two towers come down is sort of a wake-up call to something that we haven't done yet, because that shouldn't have happened, and we shouldn't have to rely on the CIA and FBI and defense. I mean, if we have a society now where we watch everything because we could be hit everywhere, it's just what's going on doesn't make any sense, and I feel very much that a dialogue about the future of architecture, transportation, all of these things, I mean, you know, it's not just architecture, the building architecture, but city design has to happen. And something went wrong, and to just go for taking the bad guys out. I mean, we don't know yet what the reason is why this happens. Someone else might find the same. We have to get to the bottom of what is the reason for this happening. If one terrorist, 10 years later we might have another terrorist just because we didn't get to the root of the problem.